So I think we've just gone one past, which is normally about what we would give people to log on. As I said, my name is Alex Scott. I'm the branch secretary of Together. Today we're talking to members in schools in relation to primarily where we're at with wages, but also we want to cover this morning where we're at generally with the collective bargaining process. So before we start today, I'd just like to formally acknowledge the traditional owners on the land which we're meeting across the state and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today we will try and limit the time for this Zoom, and we'll hopefully do a number of these Zooms over the coming months to try and provide you with accurate and real-time information in relation to where we're at with bargaining. But today's Zoom was particularly designed around the fact that their education workers should have received a pay increase in your pay backdated to the 1st of March this year, should be appearing in people's pay packets today. So as part of that, we thought that given it was a March payment, which is a bit unusual for public sector workers who generally have been paid on the 1st of August or the 1st of September, we thought it'd be worthwhile just talking through why we've got to where we're at with wages and what it looks like in terms of bargaining this year in terms of Education Queensland. So in terms of bargaining, historically, education has been in a different group of structures. Kind of 20 years ago or so, there was a standalone education agreement, and that then started to get splintered. And then for a number of kind of 10 years or so, 15 years, we had a situation where members in education and in schools were covered by the core EB. And that presented significant difficulties for our members in schools, in that traditionally we are much stronger in our schools membership than we are in some of the other white-collar CBD type buildings. And for a number of agreements in a row, we were in a situation where members in schools were willing and able to fight longer for issues, but while they were the strongest element of our core EB, they were in a minority and they would get consistently outvoted in relation to whether to accept an offer or whether to keep on it, campaigning for something better. So to try and resolve that situation, we were able to, during 2019, be able to get through a process whereby we could force a separate agreement for education, which then provided us with the ability to campaign longer and on the issues that were specific to schools. We did the whole of education because of, in terms of being able to get the Industrial Commission to approve a scope order at the time. We felt that it was best to try and go a whole employer rather than have the situation where we tried to exclude head office or regional office and then have that fail generally. So that was a significant improvement structurally in terms of the ability of workers and Together members in schools to campaign on the issues that were important to them. But then in terms of the second half of that year, we then saw the interaction with the award and the EB come to a fore, and there was a significant dispute that was common to child safety, the core and Education Queensland about where wages sat and whether 2.5% should apply in terms of their wages policy to the wages people were getting, or in terms of the historical amount that was in the certified agreement that was less than people were getting. So that really was happening as a result of the fact that the award was being successful in terms of continually moving, but was also a hangover from the period in kind of 2012, 2013, where because of delays in the core, we had a couple of years where there wasn't a wage outcome during collective bargaining. So in terms of that process, that was an extended period of disputation between ourselves and the government. The initial process around resolution for that was then there was a breakthrough in 2020 where we saw that the government then started towards into 2019 and 2020 where we saw that the government was willing to offer the $12.50 as a one-off payment. And they went back to us, and while we went into arbitration in the beginning of 2019, we actually ran the whole case for Education Queensland, and then government wages policy changed, and they offered us a $12.50 one-off payment to try and settle both the core child safety and Education Queensland's agreements. And that was then a period of further discussions, and we ended up with a resolution whereby we settled for the $12.50, but we agreed to continue to argue around the wages issue. So wages was put to one side. We had an agreement to settle, and then members in education voted to accept the $12.50 and keep fighting the arbitration on the wages issue alone. But that then hit the road bump in relation to the COVID experience starting in 2020 when the pandemic first hit, and the government announced a wages freeze at the start of 2020, kind of April 2020, almost 2 years ago now, where they said that the 1250 wouldn't be applying, and that was halfway through the ballot of education members. So during 2020, we then had a process of disputation about the introduction of the legislative wages freeze, but also about whether members in education could certify their agreement. They'd already got the 1250 in their pockets, so that was paid prior to the certification, but there was an issue just around the certification. And then as that process evolved around the wages freeze, then that process was implemented by legislation. It froze certified agreement wages, but not award rates. And even though we had a certified agreement, rates in education were still set by the award. So in terms of that process, the wages freeze came in, and then during that process, after the wages freeze came in, effectively what that did was that it stopped any payments, EB payments in 2021 were frozen and then deferred. And then we then had further discussions with government about what that would mean in terms of the arbitration of wages. So for members who were covered by certified agreements, had their wages set by certified agreements, they didn't get their 2020 pay rise. And then they had zero pay rise, and then they had a pay rise in terms of most of those agreements, which are similar in timeframes for Education Queensland, got a pay rise in September last year, and then get a pay rise on the 1st of March this year. School teachers were 3 months earlier, so they didn't get a pay rise on 1 July 2020. They got the pay rise in July 2021, and they got a 1 January pay rise this year. And so as part of the resolution on wages, we were able to get an agreement with government that we got a 1.75% increase in 2020 because we were still on the award. But then we were able to negotiate that as part of that resolution to try and move above the award, but also to reduce the differential between our members in schools and our members in the core and other government departments. We were able to keep that 1.75, but also get a further 2.5% in 2021, and then get the 2.5% in the last 6 months of the agreements, which for Education Queensland means the pay rise that we got this year as of last week, which is in your pay packets hopefully today. So in terms of that, we had an arbitration process, then we had the 1250, and then we had a further arbitration that got negotiated out, which was that we would then effectively get, rather than the 7.5% over 3 years, we ended up with kind of 9.25. So that was really getting that additional 1.75 in 2020, which then made our success in that process. So that was really where we've got to in terms of wages, and why we've got the pay rise today in your pay packets was out of the kind of the quite convoluted process that we went through. But the outcome of that means in terms of bargaining that the core went for a 4-year agreement, as the child safety education members went for a 3-year agreement. So what that means is you've got a pay rise. We've got a couple of pay rises over the last couple of years. You've now got a pay rise on 1 March this year, which is consistent with government wages policy, and the 2.5 everybody got in the last bargaining round, except for those areas where we've been able to get that additional 1.75 in 2020. But you're now up for bargaining again in terms of that process. And I think one of the unexpected, unintended consequences of the government's kind of crackdown on wages through the wages freeze legislation was that they had a number of agreements that were finishing in 2021 and had no more agreements, no more pay rises to come through. So for groups like our medical officers in health, the only way that they could apply a pay freeze for that financial year was to extend their agreements by 12 months. So a number of agreements had no pay rise in that kind of 2020-21 financial year, but their agreements were extended for 12 months, and then they got 2.5% payments in the 21-22 year, which are either in kind of 1 July, 1 March, depending on what that actually means. So effectively, they ended up with 4-year agreements with 2.5%, with kind of 2.5, 2.5, 0.5. rather than some other agreements which had 3-year agreements, which was 2.505. So that doesn't sound that important at one level, but what that has meant is there's been a significant contraction in the timeframes for bargaining. And in terms of that process, what we're now seeing is where we used to have bargaining spread out over 3 years or 2.5 years. What we're now seeing is public sector bargaining has now really been contracted to about a 6-month, if not a 3-month period. Initially, the nurses who are a significant agreement was up in April for renegotiation. Those negotiations have been significantly delayed because of COVID, so they haven't got close to finalising an arrangement. But then we have a significant tranche of public sector agreements that are all due on the 1st of July this year, and then we'd be looking at kind of campaigns that would occur in July into August for protected action to try and move wages. And then we have another tranche of very significant Together membership in the August-September kind of timeframes, which is primarily our membership in schools and our membership in Queensland Health, but also UWU's membership in schools, health. And schools, they've got separate agreement for us, but they're on the same timeframes now, where previously there was a year out between teacher aides, the school cleaners and the core. That now is those agreements line up exactly, but also the membership that we have in schools as well as UWU in the same coverage, not the same coverage, same agreements in health, and also the UWU membership in ambulance. So from a strategic point of view, one of the challenges we always have during collective bargaining is that the government says wages is not negotiable, that they've got a wages policy that is set. And they also then say, well, you can't get more than the wages policy because they've just settled 6 months earlier or 6 months later with a range of other unions in a range of other occupational groups. And so every occupational group and every profession within the public sector has been stuck in this kind of situation where they can't really challenge wages policy because the government is so entrenched in defending it because they've just done, they've locked those figures in for other agreements. So broadly, what we're wanting to talk to members in health about and also in education about is while we want to do the traditional process of trying to look at resolving your non-wage issues through bargaining and looking at what that looks like, and we've got that survey out for members at the moment to consider what are the issues that are important to you. Strategically, my advice to members is I think we need to be thinking about whether we campaign about wages earlier. And we did this about a decade ago quite successfully in 2000, or 15 years ago, about 2007, 2008, where we were able to have a lining up of public sector agreements and also then the ability for all public sector workers to campaign together to move wages. What that would mean in terms of a practical sense for education members, and we're having this conversation also with health members, is that whether we would actually move some of our campaigning capacity in relation to just the wages component, not the other issues, but just wages, into a July-August conversation rather than September-October conversation, which is what we would traditionally be doing. My view on that is I think we aren't necessarily going to be able to move wages policy. Clearly, 2.5% is well below inflation, and we're getting feedback, particularly from our health members, and we're starting to get that back in the last couple of days from education members, is that we want to challenge trying to get a pay rise above 2.5. But to do that, I think the ability to move the 2.5 wages policy will be stronger if we campaign together in July, August, rather than coming to you in September saying, well, all these other agreements, the teachers, the coppers, the fireys, medical officers, Queensland Transport, will all have settled potentially their agreements by the time we start having a significant industrial capacity in schools and in health. So that's where the health members are at, and that's what they're looking at doing. But we're also wanting to think about whether that's something that would be of interest to members. And we're having this conversation with UWU as well in relation to them saying that we should be looking at campaigning earlier, not necessarily using the traditional protected action process for that wages campaign. It would have to be a different style of campaign. We'll be able to do that in places like our medical officers who would be covered by that process, but it would be more likely to be mass activities, kind of political and community campaigning rather than work bans or strike action per se, although we will have to consider that as members make their decisions about what to do. So really, I think it would then mean, in terms of that, we would then have to negotiate with the other unions around a common claim and a common strategy. And that's really why we want to talk to members in education about it today and over the next month or so is to work out, do we come up with a specific wage claim just for schools and education, and then kind of do that in September, October after other people have campaigned and settled? Or do we say that we're willing to have a common approach, come up with a common claim, and therefore, and then move into a common campaign? That would reduce the power of workers in education to determine the dollar amount in terms of our claim, but it would give more power to workers in education to be part of a conversation around what is the settlement and what does the actual figure in terms of negotiations with government look like. So I think the claim themselves is less relevant, and that's my advice to you, but that the actual being at the bargaining table with the other unions like the teachers, the nurses, the coppers and the fireys in June, July, as well as Together's membership in terms of MOCA, the doctors and our other health membership, I think provides us with more capacity to win and then more capacity to actually deliver a change to 2.5. If members are comfortable and think 2.5 is all we should be asking for, I think we can still do that, and we will then have that conversation in August, come the bargaining, your bargaining negotiations. But if we're looking at a strategy in relation to trying to move government wages policy, which isn't something we've done particularly successfully, we were able to get better than wages policy in the last bargaining round in education, just because we were so far behind because of the 2012, 2013 kind of Newman period. But in terms of moving the headline figure, my view is that we are stronger together, and working with the other unions gives us more chance of winning than trying to stand alone in terms of bargaining just with Education Queensland after all the other agreements have primarily been finalised, and the ability of the government to turn around and say, well, we'll give education members, Together members in education, more than 2.5, and we've just given 2.5 to police, fire, doctors, and a range of other groups, I think is unlikely. So from that perspective, that's why we're talking about having a different approach, asking members in the survey at the moment, explaining why we've got the 2.5 now in terms of a March payment, which is a bit unusual, but also then talking about the broader strategy about, do we think that a combined campaign is more likely to be successful, and is that something that members in education and in schools in particular would value, or whether they don't see the issue in relation to the actual percentage figure as being a priority for them in terms of the current bargain. Independently of wages, there's still a bunch of other things to look at in terms of our bargaining process, and particularly given this is only our second standalone agreement for education members, we think that there are a range of issues that historically we were able to get some good outcomes last year for specific occupational groups within Education Queensland, but we weren't able to get everything addressed, and we were never able to get everything addressed in one bargain. But this is only our second standalone agreement in Education Queensland, so there is a survey that went out already to members, and that's really trying to work through the issues that are important to you of a non-wage component. So if we do, whether we do just accept the 2.5 and do that in the second half of the year, or whether we look at the wages campaign in conjunction with other unions and other parts of Together membership in July, irrespective of that, they'll still be bargaining in August, September around a standalone education agreement for non-wage components. And that's really what we're using that survey for, is to then try and work through what are the issues that members care about, and what are the things that you think should be on the bargaining table, and what the resolutions that we're seeking to try and make workers' lives better in schools and education more broadly. So as part of that, what I think we're really keen to think through is making sure that we get as many people participating in that process as possible. And because I think that's going to be a key factor for us in terms of the making sure that the log of claims that we put forward is the best possible claim that we can have, but also has enough support from members to be able to win irrespective of the wages process. But that is going to be complicated. There are a lot of different groups amongst our membership in schools, and so what we're looking for is trying to maximise the number of people who participate in the survey, but also have a conversation about that. And so I think a key part of that's going to be about the ability to have workplace meetings, and we'll be asking people to, if they're willing to assist in having a workplace meeting in their workplace as part of that survey process, particularly on the non-wage components, and then be able to work that through as a staged process. After that survey has been completed, we'll then come back, and the delegates will come back probably in term after school holidays. We'll do a report back meeting on what that what those what came out of that survey, and then there'll be a delegate kind of meeting in May, which will then finalise the log and then make that decision also around the wages component in terms of based on the feedback we've got from that, and then we'll look at the kind of working through the negotiations about Education Queensland specific, and then either running a wages campaign, then a bargaining campaign, or just doing a combined wages and bargaining campaign later in the year. So in terms of that process, what we'd be keen to do is find out who is available and interested in having those meetings. At the end of the day, what we're able to achieve this year in terms of making a difference for working lives for workers in schools is going to depend on our strength and our capacity to campaign. And only by having more members involved and more people becoming members as part of that process, we have the opportunity to force outcomes from Education Queensland. These bargaining processes are never easy, but at the end of the day, what we have shown time and again, where we have enough member involvement around issues that workers care about and are willing to do something about, we have been able to force change. What we need to do is make sure that this time around that the issues that we're campaigning around are the ones that matter to enough members and enough workers to make sure that we can then drive some real reform and make a real change. So I'm sorry if that's a bit of a technical presentation today, and hopefully I didn't speak too fast, but we were trying to keep it within the timeframes. We will be able to get as much people who have said they're willing to have meetings, we'll follow those up afterwards, and you'll be contacted by organisers over the next coming days to work that through. But we would certainly encourage people to participate in the current campaign. If you've got suggestions about how we can do this technology better in the future, because we'd like to try and do these sort of meetings on a regular basis. We have used Teams in the past, but that has become unstable for the larger sort of activities we're talking about in education and health. So we are using Zoom, and we recognise that does provide some technical challenges in schools and health, but it certainly appears to be a more of a robust situation in Teams. So thank you everybody for participating today. You'll get an email later today asking for feedback about how we can do this process better. But at the end of the day, what we do need to make sure is the more people who get involved in the campaign this year, the more chance we have of making a real difference to your working lives, but also to consider the question about how should we do wages? Should we do it as a combined union movement, or should we do it separately for education members later in the year? My recommendation is we are stronger together, but it's really up to you as members in schools and education to make that decision. So thank you everybody for your time. I hopefully the technology has worked in terms of the process, and we will. And I apologise if it failed at your end. And if there are questions we weren't able to get to, given the number of people online, we'll certainly we'll send up an email that you'll be able to respond to later this afternoon. So thank you for your participation today.